So today we have a forum by Joanna Borromeo, and the title is A Call for Structural Change in Canadian Jazz. Joanna Borromeo is a treasure of Calgary's soul, jazz, and R&B music scene, a vocalist, pianist, and Juno-nominated recording artist influenced by some of the deepest, most beautiful musicians in history. To date, Joanna has produced 2 independent albums, Through the Dark, released in 2010, and Kaleidoscope, released in 2014, a record that earned her a Juno Award nomination for Soul R&B Recording of the Year. Since releasing her first self-produced EP in 2010, her original music has landed on numerous R&B, soul, and jazz radio charts across Canada and has garnered listeners both at home and abroad. Her music has also landed her opportunities to perform in some of California's most significant music venues for jazz, hip-hop, R&B, and soul, including the Blue Whale in LA and Yoshi's in San Francisco. Along the way, she has performed at the Edmonton International Jazz Festival, the Medicine Hat Jazz Festival, and the Toronto International Jazz Festival. So thank you for being here, Joanna.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure. Yeah. So this is actually the second time I'm presenting this topic, a call for structural change in Canadian jazz, and it's a topic that is pretty close to my heart because I am an active member in the Canadian jazz community, and I have been since I would say maybe the early 2000s, and I've seen a lot of change happen, a lot of progress being made. But it wasn't until I was invited to present at the inaugural uh, Tune In, Tune Up conference, which was presented by Jazz YYC here in Calgary, um, to highlight gender justice in jazz. And I had this wonderful opportunity to do some further research about patriarchy in jazz and its history, what it's what it's what it has looked like since the beginnings of jazz in the United States, and how it's moved around in the Canadian region for jazz, and um, and along the way, I've discovered a lot of really interesting points that I'd like to bring up. So these are my thoughts. Um, just to kind of get started here, I would like to just break down my topic into 3 sections that I'll get into as we go. The first part is just a brief synopsis of what I think are indicators of patriarchy in jazz. I've kind of posed a question: how have jazz's historic gender biases and gendered attitudes encouraged internalized patriarchy? Um, and I find that internalized patriarchy is an important issue to discuss because removing it is another step towards achieving gender justice. So, in that section, I will also talk about what internalized patriarchy is and what it looks like and how it impacts not just women, but also men too, but primarily women. The second part of my discussion is it focuses on the Canadian jazz scene and what external societal forces have informed the Canadian jazz scene throughout history and presently, and how patriarchy continues to play a role in Canada. Um, so uh, so a few things that I wanted to just kind of mention here, which I'll dig into further, is I've noticed that, and not just I, but women in jazz across Canada have noticed, and men as well, have noticed its policy is very different from its practice, and so we'll dive into that, and we'll talk about in institutional and structural systems that um, perpetuate patriarchy in jazz. Um, and then I conclude this topic with addressing institutions in Canadian jazz, and kind of highlight what's been done about gender justice in jazz. And I'll close with thoughts on what I think could could be done further about it. So so let's get into it. Um, all right, indicators of patriarchy in jazz. Generally speaking, it involves activities of gatekeeping, the tendency to commodify music and musicians, and and perpetuating hostile workspaces for women. And I would also just like to take a moment to say that um, it includes transgendered people as well, especially, and we'll get into that in greater detail. Um, but what I consider gatekeepers and influencers of jazz discourse, we're talking about jazz faculty members at schools, educational institutions, club owners, booking agents, managers, band leaders, even musicians themselves, journals and jazz critics and scholars, and even musicologists and ethnomusicologists. Those are they all are predominantly those are roles predominantly filled by men. Um, and 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 why is this problematic, or it creates or perpetuates patriarchy? Is it creates a scene for men by men, which of course leads to gender biases and gendered attitudes. Um, and because these gendered attitudes and biases inform the discourse of jazz and the practice of jazz, this tends to ascribe a culturally masculine set of characteristics uh, to what is thought of as authentic or real jazz. Um, and when that happens, that obviously subordinates women, because feminine attributes are considered not authentic ways to perform jazz or even pursue jazz careers. Um, so the idea of gatekeeping and influencing the direction that jazz will move in from spaces to spaces and times and other places, is this persistence of this idea of a boys' club, which pretty much says women aren't as good as men musically speaking, because intellectually they're not as bright as men, and that has been these are obviously much older perspectives now. Obviously, now that we're in 2022, I mean that a lot of that kind of sentiment has changed. But certainly, when I was going to school, when I went to Humber College in Toronto in the early 2000s, um, that that was totally a thing that I witnessed and was forced to engage with, um, alongside all of the other women musicians, students that were, you know, working towards a degree and hopefully kickstart a career. And that continued. That kind of sentiment continued all the way into the 2010s when I moved back to Calgary, and it was stronger actually. Um, so that's an interesting thing. Now that we're into the 2020s, it's definitely different, and I'm grateful for that. I'm happy about that. But part of this attitude also includes the idea that women primarily don't choose or are interested in choosing or can, you know, play what's considered as masculine instruments. So so there's this idea of the feminization of instruments, where it's vocals as a feminine instrument, and even the language around saying, okay, you know, referring to musicians and then separating vocalists from that, uh, uh, from instrumentalists, as if the voice cannot be used as an instrument itself. That's already that's already compounding on this attitude of masculinity and what's considered authentic jazz and not. And that just that just bolsters sexism and the notion that masculinity is supposed to dominate and tame and control femininity and of course women. um, so in addition to this idea of gatekeeping and influencing, and men primarily holding these these positions in the community. What's promoted is a homophobia, um, due to an insecurity introduced by this, subsequent gender divide created by pitting masculinity against femininity, and perceiving masculine attributes as dominant, favorable traits, musically speaking and even socially speaking. And homophobia is definitely, it, I mean, it was definitely, very prominent in the 20s and 30s, when, in the 40s and all the way throughout, and it was considered, the LGBTQ community was certainly underground, and, people's careers were on the line, if ever, a musician considered risking, you know, be living their authentic selves. And so when this idea of masculinity being the dominant and uh, favorable set of characteristics on music and culture, um, that definitely creates an environment of homophobia that is very, very unsafe, and very hostile to those affected by it. Um, Now, one thing that, I also wanted to add, though, in this version of the presentation that I didn't really get a chance to speak on previously, is, just the notion that, you know mask patriarchy also impacts male musicians, in Canada. Uh, the idea of having to be a bro, so to speak, bro culture, and you got to dominate. You got to take up that space. You can't feel your emotions without feeling a tinge of violence and domination, like that. That's also very harmful for men in jazz. Um, it puts a limit on what can be explored, um, when it comes to an individual exploring their identity, and their expression, through music. And so, yeah, this idea of gatekeepers and influencers, wanting to uphold this ideal of what real jazz is supposed to be, that absolutely perpetuates patriarchy. Um, so let's move on to the idea of commodifying tendencies of jazz, and this is something that's carried out by and uh, industry members, and musicians. When I say industry members, I'm talking about people who work in, record labels, who facilitate that. Basically, people who have the money, and people who, and that also includes, people who are patrons of jazz. People who go out and spend their money to, experience, a jazz concert. Um, these commodifying tendencies ultimately limit opportunities for women. It makes it harder for women to break into the scene, harder for non-binary people to also make it into the scene. Promotes the idea of the exceptional lone jazz woman, um, and perpetuates underrepresentation of women, which ultimately contributes to the historical erasure of women in jazz. So I'm going to stop right there because there's a couple more points that I can make, but let me, expand on the first few. How does commodifying tendencies limit opportunities for women? Well, um, if an industry is run by predominantly by men, and men will tend to hire other male players because male players continue to exhibit those favorable masculine traits that make jazz good, or define jazz as authentic. And so oftentimes, yeah, that just pretty much, removes many opportunities for women to be hired. Women who are just as talented, perhaps maybe even more, talented, more artistic, or just are worthy to be considered for the opportunity. Um, so commodifying tendencies, it's putting a dollar sign on art, and obviously the work of people creating this music. um, it's it basically means that women are stripped of their intrinsic worth, not just as artists but as human beings as well, because it's all about the optics. It's all about whether real jazz is being performed or can be performed on a record and then sold to an audience. And so these commodifying tendencies do extend to audience members, patrons, because when this when patriarchy is perpetuated in jazz culture, um, what that means to audience members is they're looking for um, musicians of a particular caliber, of a particular sound, even how they carry themselves, how they speak, and therefore how they play. And what I find really fascinating is, obviously there are very many different genres of jazz, subgenres of jazz. But those who have the most money tend to be older and whiter and have more disposable income, and they are more familiar with the more patriarchal aspects of jazz and will tend to spend money on musical experiences that kind of reinforce the comfort of tradition, which unfortunately the comfort of tradition does involve a lot of patriarchy, and there's a lack of representation for women, and this idea that men can really play their instruments. so um, so the cycle continues. The cycle just simply continues, and what that really just boils down to is, it just women are constantly battling the burden of how this kind of situation makes them feel about themselves, makes them feel about other women, makes them feel about the their work space, their work environment, and how they feel about other men. And sometimes women will play into that idea just so that they can survive in such a hostile industry. Sometimes they will go against it and put their network on the line, um, and that's unfair, to put it bluntly. Um, yeah. So now the worst example of commodifying tendencies, which does cause the internalization of patriarchy within women. The worst example would be all female groups. And I know that this is a sensitive topic because I am aware that there are some jazz groups that are run by women, and all of them are women composers. They're all exceptional players within their own rights, and they all write their own music. They all put out their own records. So it would seem on the surface that an all-female group uh, is able to function in a way that creates a safe space for its members. But once you once you put this whole creative practice of making a record and for commercial benefit, once this music is commodified, it its members are subjected to capitalist practices and standards, which again reflect patriarchal um, belief systems. Again, and so what's going to sell? Well, we gotta sell to the people who are in the audience. Who are the people who are in the audience? And again, round and round this circle goes. And um, and so, again, women are stripped of their intrinsic worth as individuals and as players, because now they have to check off specific boxes that fit this patriarchal narrative that real jazz is masculine jazz. So it's problematic. um, so my third point that I wanted to make in this part of my presentation is to further go deeper into the subordination of women, which creates hostile spaces for work. Um, Being a musician that's attended jazz events, attended concerts, produced concerts, played on records, um, gathered amongst colleagues. I do notice a tendency for even just in just you know like individual dialogue between people or small groups, when it comes to talking about jazz, or jazz discourse in general. um, Women are talked over oftentimes, and I've noticed this a lot over the 2 decades that I've been a musician in the jazz scenes here in Canada. um, and it creates this odd dynamic, forcing either women to be louder and then therefore perceived as more aggressive, because again, women are supposed to be quieter, softer, and more accommodating, rather than claiming space, you know. And that when women claim space, of course, that's perceived as aggression, and which is very negative, very very negative. um, However, if it's in their nature, if it's in a woman's nature to be just generally, more outgoing or louder or comfortable in addressing groups, and not being afraid to just speak louder or speak longer, it seems to be fine. But when it's considered not their nature, like if generally women tend to just listen more than speak, it's offensive. And it creates another layer of subordination against women. In fact, it can make other women in the room feel uncomfortable, which is odd sometimes. That doesn't happen all the time, but that's certainly something that I've witnessed firsthand. Um, and then this idea of having to be talked over and then having to like demand space for a woman. It's it's jarring for men when women say, "Hey, be quiet," because somebody's trying to say something here, and this is a woman. But it's also very weird when and I'm speaking very off the cuff here. It's very strange to be validated by a man and saying, when a man says, "Hey, everybody be quiet," and then people are like paying attention right away, or they change their perspective on on a woman. And I've seen that even in recent times, just in a certain jazz club, even here in Calgary, which I won't mention. But it took the band leader's musician, one of the band leader's musicians. Band leader was a woman, and one of the musicians in the band was a male, and he had to say, "Hey, this is an artist who has this uh, this long list of credentials." And then all of a sudden, the club owner just completely just stopped interrogating this artist, and just let her play. um, so it's wild that this kind of thing still continues to happen, and we take it for granted, and it happens so quickly, and almost we don't know how to respond to it in a more constructive and effective way. We just Another piece of internalized patriarchy is that men seem to feel like they can fix it, and historically speaking, that has tended to be the case, but again, not because uh, not because they're the women can't, but it's more expedient. Um, so there needs to be an increase of capacity for better dialogue. Moving on. Um, Now, hostile and unsafe spaces obviously do take a mental toll on women. Um, it puts into question: Are they good enough? Are we good enough? Um, will somebody play with us if we ask them? Um, is my writing good enough? Is my communication and management skills good enough to lead a band? And all of that takes a mental toll. What about the other aspects of myself? Um, that like, is there incongruency in different pieces of my identity that will actually make it harder for me to be a successful musician in the jazz scene? um, and this, it's exhausting. And when women are constantly taught from an early stage in their career that they need the benevolence of male approval to make a woman's work legit, like that really makes women feel that women can't thrive on their own in the ways in which they would like to, and go about it in the ways that they would want to. And so there has been statistics about success rates of women who enter the jazz music scene from school, if they attend a jazz post secondary, if they get a degree. And it's a small percentage, small, very very small percentage. They tend to not continue. They end up um, leaving the jazz scene at some point. Many women tend to, um, simply because it's what they're up against when it comes to even just surviving the music scene is challenging enough. And then that compounded with like the patriarchal culture that is very present in the jazz microcosm. It's just as it's much harder. Um, Now, there is very limited access to jobs for women, not just gigs, opportunities to play in clubs, but other roles, such as college level educators, music journalists, music programmers, music promoters, even radio hosts, writers, musicologists. If you just look at it, it wouldn't be hard to really see that. You could just do a quick Google search on like who's staffed at this jazz magazine, or who's staffed at this reputable music institution. You'll see that the ratio of women to men in in influential roles on the on I guess the entire jazz scene is very imbalanced. um, and so this gatekeeping and influencing of jazz discourse is it's really inequitable for women. And so I'd like to move on to the next section of my topic, and just kind of break down internalized patriarchy a little bit more. um, so internalized patriarchy, like I had mentioned before, it really influences how women see each other, how women see themselves in the scene, how women see themselves as artists, um, as members of a community, and also it influences how they relate to men as well. And so there's many opportunity for women to have to, not opportunity, but women are kind of made to navigate such a complex environment. um, Music is all about relationships, and so women are exposed to not just having to grapple with gender roles and gender biases, but straight up sexism and misogyny. And that can internalize that could really take a toll on how a woman sees herself as a musician in such an environment. um, and it certainly makes it really easy for men to just say, well, I'm really comfortable how things are, and um there and be completely oblivious to, like, the experience of women musicians. um so some ways in which patriarchy is internalized for women: this heightened sense of competition as the only way to succeed. um and then also, on the flip side of that same coin, a sense of powerlessness. So the idea of favoring masculine as authentic jazz, masculine ways to perform as authentic jazz. Women will tend to suppress feminine traits, how they carry themselves, how they talk, and then how they write, how they play, how they compose their music. Um, like, I've spoken to many women in the industry, and it's not common for women to change their posture when there's a male presence in the same space, or even change the pitch of their speaking tone. That's happened, and sometimes it's something that just happens automatically, and then they're in the middle of noticing it when it's happening, and they're like, "That's really weird." But it continues because it's accepted by everybody in the room. Um, this loss of feminine traits leads to less support for each other, which then breeds more competition, because it plays into this idea that you know less support for each other means, okay, well, that means we're now in competition with each other. And then it promotes this idea that there's this lone exceptional jazz woman, which is a zero sum game. One's loss is another's gain. So the concept of the lone exceptional jazz woman, if you Google the greatest female jazz artists of all time, they tend to be, like, only a few names pop up, and they tend to be singers. And then when you look at, like, if you think of, okay, women instrumentalists, primarily there tends to be like only one or two. There's room for one or two that really succeed and really, really um, make it in a sense that they're on everybody's top of mind. It's their name that comes to mind when somebody asks, well, who's your favorite saxophone player? Oh, Christine Jensen. Or like, who's your favorite um, jazz arranger? Oh, Maria Schneider. Like, there's literally only one. But, and I kind of say that humorously, but really, when you think about, like, what is the official history of women in jazz, like, there's not a lot of names come up. Um, and so this, again, just like, there's only room for one lone exceptional jazz woman, like that creates another layer of competition that extends to gatekeeping, women gatekeeping women, which I've also seen, which is toxic masculine behavior, and it also represents a lack of empathy, and that's patriarchy as well. So circling back on the I guess the difficulty with moving forward with, like, all women uh, jazz groups. Um, I understand in theory that, you know these groups are formed to try to create a space that is, like, separate from all of that negative stuff. But once commercial success becomes, like, one of, like, the goals of why this group is formed, um, then old habits come back, and you know then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we got to get the best of the best women in jazz. Who do we turn to? The lone exceptional jazz woman, for bass, for drums, for sax, for voice, and piano. um, which causes further marginalization of women in general. um, yeah, absolutely limits the opportunities for women. It silences all the other work that other women musicians in Canada and abroad are contributing to jazz. So yeah, it's it's very alienating and marginalizing. Um, Also, not just with women jazz musicians in general, but women jazz musicians who also are racialized, or are members of the LGBTQ communities. Um, yeah, so that makes it even more complicated, and yeah, it favors even white women, um, more than not. So this on the other side of competition is the sense of powerlessness, belief that they can't that women can't thrive without the help of an industry member who is most likely male. Um, and so this sense of powerlessness creates opportunity for men to perform or engage in the activity of benevolent sexism. Um, and that's problematic. And I see that happening, even within my local community, as well, where um, yeah, it's kind of like benevolent sexism. Oh, you're an artist, you're a musician, trying to make it in this industry. Here, let me help you. But while I do that, let me reinforce the idea that you can't get anywhere without me. Oh, that's yikes. It's troublesome for sure. Troublesome. It perpetuates this dynamic of who's in power and who's not. It's not equitable. It's not diplomatic. It's benevolent sexism. Now, if a woman is uh, doesn't want to put themselves in a position like that, um, a woman can leave the music industry entirely because of belief of not being able to cut it on their instrument, or because of an insecurity for playing a feminized instrument. And that's one of many reasons why a woman would leave the industry, for sure. Because it's either benevolent sexism or straight up sexism. I don't know. Take your pick. That sounds very challenging, very challenging, and it's hostile for sure. So, what do women have to do when they're faced with these two situations of like heavy competition, and a sense of powerlessness? Well, work harder, take up more airspace, um, sometimes be at odds with your own identity, just to secure a position in the scene or secure an opportunity for future work. That takes a toll on a woman because a woman is not just a musician. Um, there's a life behind that title. Some women are mothers, some women are not, some women are involved in other things, and so um, these other these other identities take a back seat because of how much demand is placed, and how much expectation is placed on the shoulders of a woman just to have a career that is sustainable, and that's exhausting. So my last point that I wanted to make, before I talk specifically about the Canadian jazz music scene, is this idea that internalized patriarchy perpetuates a gender divide, and that's very clear with what's been mentioned earlier. But again, just to speak on the side of the male perspective, um, it's because there's such a strong divide. Men are also afraid to to express themselves in what's considered more feminine, like to navigate through a scene with more feeling, and compassion and emotion and empathy. Um, um, Not just performatively, but like genuinely, because that's not how the music scene works. Competition also leads to a lack of empathy on both sides. And so, in a nutshell, patriarchy really does harm to both men and women. So, where is the Canadian jazz music scene at right now? Well, I'll start with a brief history. The Canadian jazz scene has been and still is predominantly white and male. Um, it has been since the Juno Awards started handing out awards for Jazz Album of the Year in 1977. I did a quick Wikipedia search on who's won a Juno Award in the jazz categories, and predominantly male, predominantly white. What's interesting is like, well, the argument could be made that like there's a lot of white folk in Canada to begin with. But what's interesting interestingly, what's left out is the fact that jazz is a African American music, and African Americans brought jazz into Canada in the 20s and the 30s, um, and 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 because of immigration policy, the Great Depression, war, um, African American musicians no longer felt safe to work here and no longer felt like they could sustain a career in Canada, because white audiences only wanted to be in clubs that that only let white musicians play. And so that's why the Canadian jazz scene is predominantly white and male, and has been since the Junos started handing out awards for jazz albums in 1997. Sorry, 1977. So, so the Canadian jazz music scene, I think in policy stands for gender equality, but in practice it stands for gender inequity. Examples, like a contemporary example, a modern day example, Michael Bublé and his band. When he goes on tour, all of his musicians are male. The people who travel with him and play with him from city to city are all male. When I saw Michael Bublé last year, I really enjoyed the concert. It was great. I really do enjoy his music, but I could not help but see the a clear representation of gender divide, quite literally on stage. Um, One half, all the male musicians, and they were all playing masculinized instruments, horns, drums, all of that. On the other side, they were all string players, and they were all women, and they were all, um, uh, yeah, and they were all local musicians. None of them were traveling with him, um, from city to city. So yeah, in practice, Canadian jazz stands for gender inequity. So, as we've mentioned or brought up before, the Canadian jazz industry is still quite dominated by men. So just look at who's running clubs, who's booking artists touring and local, who are the scholars of jazz. They're male. Who are the educators at university level music programs? Who's writing about jazz? Um, so really, what this means is the established jazz discourse is basically unchallenged. It remains unchallenged, um, in scholarship, politics, or the oral history of jazz, even, and in the practice and entertainment industry piece of it as well. And and that's where the Canadian jazz music scene is right now. Um, let's talk about the education of jazz music in Canadian institutions. Um, when I went to Humber, and I think it's still the case, there's a lack of political, cultural, and historical education of the Canadian jazz scene and the American jazz scene. And this ignorance of privilege and the power held by, um, these positions, people, teaching these curriculums, just creates inequitable environments for women, women students. Imagine having to navigate the delicate intimacy of being in a room, oftentimes without windows, with your one-on-one music instructor, and that can be uncomfortable for women, and then also, you know, maybe a male instructor may just not simply understand the the challenge of playing an instrument, because an instrument is like not made for the to accommodate the hands of a different size of hand, and just saying, well, you just got to practice more. It's very insensitive to just kind of leave it at that and not feel inclined to investigate, well, why is this experience different from mine? So um, this lack of knowledge of the cultural history and the political history of jazz as an African American music, it being left out of the jazz curriculum from grade school all the way through post-secondary level education, it circles back on this idea of like, well, Canadian jazz is all about the craft, which in itself isn't a negative thing, but when the focus on the craft is so informed by a patriarchal system, and also racism, um, gender and racial injustice persists. It's then there's no capacity or interested in correcting that, and having a more nuanced curriculum, and then women and people of color are just subject to instances of tokenism when they go around and play. That doesn't happen all the time, and then on the other side of there's this whole thing of like, well, I don't, and I guess I'm kind of digressing a little bit, but where I don't see color, that's also problematic. Well, I don't see you as a woman player. I just see you as good. That's problematic. That kind of sentiment, um, and so that's where the Canadian jazz music scene is. And we play standards, all predominantly mostly written by men, because that's how the jazz book of standards has been for over the course of decades. So that needs to change too. um, so what's been done so far about it in Canada? I see a lot of universities across Canada presenting panels on gender justice and jazz. I see jazz organizations from city to city producing conferences and events that are more equitable for women, and also speak on gender justice. And you know, there's definitely activity being done to change the narrative here. Um, but what isn't being done? And so this is going to be the last section of my presentation, um, and I'm going to focus really on institutions like schools, because that's where most people's careers begin. If they're going to pursue a career in jazz, they go to school, um, and they study from jazz musicians. Um, there needs to be more representation of women educators in these schools, um, because without it, there's no opportunity for more empathetic and more nuanced education. There isn't. There are missed opportunities to create safer spaces for women students, and also, um, you know, um, male musicians as well. Um, but a more a more equitable environment for teachers will lead to a better education for students, and the success rate for women to enter the workforce and stay in the Canadian jazz scene will increase. So I did look at all of the faculty uh, websites of the biggest and most prominent jazz schools, and even the smaller ones. I don't have the I don't have the that piece of paper with me where I could say exactly how many women instructors are at U of T, but the range was anywhere between, for all schools across Canada, the range was anywhere between, I think, maybe 6% and maybe 30%, but 30% was definitely just the one out of many. If we take that 30%, that school that had 30% women on faculty, it quickly reduces to just under 20%. So that's kind of where Canadian jazz is at, and I think in general, those who are gatekeeping and influencing um, the way that jazz is moving, should call for those who are in positions of power, a hiring power, that is, to hire out of their circles and hire more women. Um, and that, I think that alone will definitely change a lot. Other things that I would say would be really great, as goals, for all of us in the jazz music scene to strive towards, is stop regarding women as placeholders in jazz discourse, um, and actually, let them have, let them be in these roles for extended periods of time, where they can shape, and they can shape the jazz community, where they are. Um, I think it would be really wonderful to study the interconnections between music, culture, and society, where women are included in the discussion. So, changing the history of who's created music, and added to the canon of jazz compositions. Um, and also challenge the official jazz histories. We rarely hear about the marginalization of women, the historical invisibility of women. Certainly, the homophobia that was very prevalent in jazz, throughout the decades, especially when jazz was pretty much run by organized crime organizations. I also would really love to see the Canadian jazz scene, um, re-see jazz performance as a historically informed African American practice. I think that's very important to do, because it just, we must. And if there's, I would love to also see at institutions, uh, kind of more, well-rounded programming around what courses can be taken. So if a school can have a music business class, and the study of jazz history in schools, I really think it would be valuable to include gender theories and in jazz studies, to promote inclusive conversation about jazz and its future. And that is my presentation in a nutshell. So thank you for the opportunity to share.